The Galactic Sovereignty Council had been deciding the fate of smaller civilizations for 900 years. It was good at it, and efficient. The meeting room alone was designed to make visitors feel small stone floors cut from a dead moon. Walls carved from the hull of a generation ship that had drifted for 2,000 years before running out of power and people. The council had salvaged that hull and built their chamber inside it. A reminder, the galaxy did not care how hard you tried. The galaxy only cared whether you were strong enough to survive it. Humanity was not strong enough. That was the conclusion sitting on the table when High Counselor Drevin opened the session. Drevin was Veeth. His species had 3 eyes arranged in a triangle on a flat gray face, and the third eye, the center one, never blinked. It watched everything. It had watched the human species for 11 years now, since the first human scout ship had bumbled through the Vin corridor and nearly collided with a VH patrol cruiser. The humans had apologized very enthusiastically. They had sent a follow-up message with a gift basket. Nobody in the council had known what to do with a gift basket. 11 years since that first contact, and the picture of humanity was clear. They were small. Their fleet numbered around 400 ships, modest by any standard. Their weapons technology lagged behind the council's member species by at least 60 years. Their home system had 1 populated planet and 2 mining stations that looked like they had been assembled by people who had never seen a blueprint. Their soldiers were soft-bodied, temperature-sensitive creatures who needed pressurized suits just to walk through space. But they had found the Vin corridor, and they had mapped it, and they had used it to quietly push their borders 7 sectors closer to council space in the span of a decade. That was the problem. Not the ships, not the weapons, the pushing. The quiet, steady, cheerful pushing, like something that had not yet been told where the walls were. Counselor Marin of the sketch leaned forward across the table. The Smith were thin, insect-bodied creatures with a talent for trade law and a deep ancestral memory of being conquered. They did not enjoy being near new civilizations that pushed. "The motion has been on the table for 3 weeks," she said. "We have the votes. Let us simply proceed." Drevin looked at his notes. The notes were largely ceremonial. He had already decided. The motion is to deliver a formal boundary declaration to the human species, to make clear that their expansion into sectors 1421 is no longer acceptable, to demand they pull back to their original borders. He paused. "And to send a fleet to make the declaration credible." "How large a fleet?" asked Counselor Bren of the hall. The hall were broad, rocky-skinned beings who communicated largely through shifts in posture. Bren's posture said he thought this was unnecessary, but would not argue. 300 ships, said Drevin combat ready, positioned at the edge of their outer system. They will see them on their sensors before the message even arrives. Silence. Then Marin said, "Is that not excessive for 400 ships and 2 mining stations?" Drevin closed his notes. "It is not about their ships. It is about the lesson. You teach a species what they are the first time. You do not get a second chance to establish the first impression." The vote passed 29-3. It took 6 weeks to assemble the fleet at the edge of human space. 300 ships from 9 member species, cruisers the size of small moons, carriers loaded with fighter craft, electronic warfare ships that could blind a star system's communications in under 4 minutes. Drevin himself traveled aboard the flagship, the Eternal Witness *, a Vyoth dreadnought that had fought in 4 major wars and lost none of them. They dropped out faster than light travel at 600 hours Council Standard Time, exactly 11 light minutes from Earth. Drevin stood on the bridge and looked at the display screen. There was Earth, blue and white, and very small looking. There were the 2 mining stations exactly where the reports had said they would be, drifting in lazy orbits around the outer planet they called Saturn. There was a handful of human ships, 11, the scanner said, doing routine patrol routes through the system. And there was nothing else. "Send the message," Dreen said. The message went out on all standard frequencies in 17 languages, including 3 human ones. It was polite, it was formal, it was also very clear. The Council's fleet would remain at the system's edge for 48 hours. In that time, the human government was expected to respond with confirmation that they accepted the boundary terms. If no confirmation came, the fleet would advance to enforce compliance. Then they waited. The response came in 9 hours. Not a surrender, not an agreement, a request for a meeting. The human government, something called the Unified Earth Assembly, expressed great respect for the Galactic Sovereignty Council. They were very sorry for any confusion regarding the boundary sectors. They would be happy to discuss the matter in detail. They were sending a representative. One ship. Lieutenant Commander Oris, the VA officer handling communications, read the message 3 times before bringing it to Drevin. One ship, sir. They say it is their diplomatic vessel. Drevin looked at the message. One ship. Yes. We sent 300. Yes. Drevin was quiet for a moment. He thought about the gift basket 11 years ago. He thought about the cheerful apology from the scout crew. He thought about the way humanity had spent a decade quietly expanding without ever seeming to notice that expanding without permission was the sort of thing that got civilizations removed from the galaxy's guest list. Fine, he said. We receive them on one ship. We give them their meaning. We make the terms clear in person. Sometimes a species needs to see the numbers on a screen and the ships outside their window at the same time before the mathematics becomes real to them. He did not think this would be complicated. The ship arrived 17 hours later. It came in slow, which was standard for diplomatic approach, a signal that you were not preparing to attack. It followed the correct council protocols for requesting approach clearance, broadcasting IFFF codes on the right frequencies, maintaining a safe distance from the fleet's outer perimeter until it was waved through. All correct, all by the book. Drevin watched it on the main display as it entered the visual range of the *Eternal Witnesses *forward cameras. It was not a large ship, maybe 400 minutes long, about a quarter the size of the *Eternal Witness*. Long and angular in a way that made Drevin think of something built for speed rather than comfort. Dark grey hull, almost black. No visible weapon ports on the exterior, which he noted. Either it was unarmed, or the weapons were internal or recessed, which was a more sophisticated design choice than he had expected. On the hull in large white letters was a name, ISV Reckoning. ISV said Oris, Interstellar Vessel, their standard ship designation, and the name. Oris checked. Reckoning. In human language it means a calculation of consequences, or the moment when debts are settled. Drevin looked at the name for a moment. They named their diplomatic ship that. It appears so, sir. He decided not to read too much into the name. Species named their ship strangely. The sketch had a diplomatic cruiser called the *Beautiful Morning. Names meant nothing. Hail them, he said. The face that appeared on screen was human, female, dark-skinned, short hair, wearing what appeared to be a military uniform rather than a diplomat's dress, which Drevin noted. She had the kind of face that was very still, not cold, just still, like something that had learned not to show its calculations. High Counselor Drevin, she said. Her pronunciation of his name was good, better than most alien species managed. I am Admiral Yara Vass of the Unified Earth Assembly. I represent our government in this matter. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Admiral, said Drevin. I note your title. We requested a diplomatic representative. I am also that, Voss said. She smiled. It was a small, patient smile. We felt that, given the nature of your visit, it would be more appropriate to send someone familiar with the military dimension of the conversation. We are not here for a military conversation, Drevin said. We are here to deliver a boundary declaration and receive your government's acceptance of its terms. Of course, said Voss. The smile did not change. We understand completely. We would like to discuss the terms in some detail if you are willing. We have some questions. Drevin agreed. He had expected this. Species always had questions when faced with the Council's authority for the first time. They bargained. They asked for modifications. They suggested counter-proposals. Then eventually they accepted because the alternative was what was sitting 11 light minutes from their home world. You may board the asterisk Eternal Witness asterisk, he said. We will meet in the reception suite. Actually, said Vas, we prefer you come to us. Another pause. Another small smile. We have refreshments. Drevin almost declined. Aboard the flagship was standard. Aboard the smaller vessel in unknown territory was not. But then he thought about the lesson again, about the mathematics of 300 ships versus 1, about how it would look 300 against 1, and the 300 were afraid to step aboard the 1. Agreed, he said. The shuttle from the asterisk Eternal Witness docked with the asterisk Reckoning asterisk. 40 minutes later, Drevin brought 12 staff members, security advisors, his translator, and specialist. He stepped through the docking tube into the human ship, and his first impression was warmth. The corridor was warmer than council standard. The lighting was slightly warmer too, a yellow tone instead of the cool white of Vaoth ships. It smelled of something he did not have a word for. A human crew member met them at the docking collar. Young male with an open face and the easy posture of someone who was not nervous. Hi, Counselor. Welcome aboard the Reckoning. I'm Lieutenant Chen. I'll take you to the Admiral. The corridors were clean and well maintained. The crew they passed, maybe a dozen humans visible in the passageways, acknowledged the visiting group with polite nods and went back to their work. No starring, no obvious anxiety. Draven's security officer, a V named Tovil, fell into step beside him and said quietly, "They are not afraid." "No," said Draven. "They should be." He did not answer that. The meeting room was at the center of the ship. Long table, chairs on both sides, a viewport at one end showing the stars. There were cups of something hot waiting at each seat. Admiral Voss was already standing when they entered. She shook Draven's hand. Humans did that. He had read about it. The physical contact was still slightly startling. Vaoth did not casually touch strangers, but he completed the gesture. "Please sit," she said. "The drink is called coffee. You don't have to try it, but it's there." They sat. Draven looked around the room. The walls were not bare. There were things mounted on them, objects, a framed photograph of what appeared to be a large gathering of humans in a wide outdoor space. A flat piece of metal with text on it that Draven's translator could not immediately parse, and in the corner, something that looked like a piece of hull plating from a different ship, scarred with what could only be weapons fire, mounted like a trophy on a small bracket. Draven looked at that last one for a moment. Voss followed his gaze. "Piece of a Kreeth raider," she said conversationally. "They tried to take our first colony ship about 30 years ago before we had real warships. We handled it." "With what?" asked Draven before he could decide whether to ask. Voss smiled again. "The same patient still smiles. The mining equipment on board," she said. "Creative application." Draven looked at his notes. The crew were not members of the Council, but they were a known species with real combat capability. "A colony ship with mining equipment should not have been able to—" "Shall we begin?" said Voss. Draven set the hull plating out of his mind. This was a boundary meeting. 300 ships won. The mathematics were clear. He opened the declaration document on his tablet and turned it to face her. She looked at it. She read it carefully all the way through without speaking. Her expression did not change. When she finished, she folded her hands on the table and looked at Draven across the space between them. "These are interesting terms," she said. "They are the Council's terms." "Yes." She tilted her head slightly. "Can I ask, and I want to be clear that I am asking genuinely, not as a negotiating position. Can I ask why you believe we will accept them?" Draven blinked his center eye slowly. This was a V gesture that meant he was choosing his words. "Because you are a small new civilization and the Council is not." "Sure," said Voss. "That's true." She glanced at the document again. "But you haven't asked us what we brought." The room was quiet. Draven looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You sent 300 ships," she said. "We sent one. I'm sure that seems like a very clear statement of the situation." She paused. We thought about it the same way. Actually, we discussed sending more ships, a fleet. Match your numbers. Make it look more balanced. Why did you not? Because one ship, said Voss, and the smile was still there, patient and small, and not going anywhere, seemed like enough. Dreven's center eye did not blink. Outside the viewport, 300 warships sat in perfect formation against the dark of space. And somewhere in the back of Dreven's mind, a very quiet, very old instinct, the instinct of something that had survived long enough to pass its caution along through 900 years of council history, said, "Ask her what is on the ship." He did not ask. Not yet. But he thought about the hull plating on the wall and the mining equipment, and the name painted on the side of the ship in white letters that meant asterisks the moment when debts are settled. He thought about the crew members who had not been afraid. And for the first time since the fleet had jumped into position 11 light minutes from Earth, High Counselor Dreven felt something he had not expected to feel in this room. He felt curious, which was, he would later reflect, the first sign that he had already lost control of the meeting. The coffee was, by any reasonable standard, a terrible beverage. Dreven had tried it because declining felt like a small loss of ground, and he was not in the habit of losing ground in any form. It was bitter. It was hot in a way that arrived at the back of the throat like a minor insult. There was a burnt smell to it that the humans in the room seemed to find comforting, based on the way they leaned over their cups before drinking. He set his cup down and returned to the document. "The terms are not a proposal," he said. "I want to be clear about that. They are not a starting point for negotiation. The Council does not negotiate boundary declarations with species under Tier 4 classification." "What's Tier 4? Asked Admiral Voss. She seemed genuinely curious. "It is the classification for civilizations in the early expansion phase, younger than 100 years of interstellar travel, limited fleet capacity, no Council membership." "Ah." She nodded slowly. "And what tier are Council member species?" "Tier 1, big gap." "Yes." She looked at the document again. She had been looking at it in intervals for the past 40 minutes, which was more time than anyone had ever spent looking at a boundary declaration in Dreven's experience. Usually, by this point, the representative of the smaller species was either crying, bargaining, or already signing. Voss was doing none of these things. She was reading the document with the focused attention of someone who was looking for something specific and had not found it yet. Dreven's advisor, a smith named Pell, leaned close to his ear. "She is stalling," Pell whispered. "I know," said Dreven. "We should press." "I know," he said again. He looked at Voss across the table. "Admiral, I understand this is not easy news to receive, but the POW, fleet outside your system, is not a negotiating tool. It is a fact. Every hour we spend in this room is an hour your government spends looking at 300 warships on their long-range sensors. I do not believe extending that experience is in your people's interest." Voss looked up from the document. "You're probably right," she said. "Can I ask you something personal?" He had not expected that. "What?" "How many of these meetings have you done? Boundary declarations, new species, this kind of thing." Dreven straightened slightly. "This is my 14th. 14. She seemed to think about that, and all 14 accepted the terms. All 14 accepted the terms. How long did the longest one take? He thought back 6 hours. The Marin Collective. They were quite stubborn, and they accepted in the end. They accepted in the end. Voss nodded. She picked up her coffee cup, took a slow drink, and set it back down. "I want you to know," she said, "I genuinely respect the Council's position. 14 for 14 is a strong record. You clearly know what you're doing." She paused. "I also want you to know that we're not the Marin Collective. No species is any other species." "That's a fair point," she smiled. "I'm going to need more time to review the terms with my government before I can give you a formal response." Dreven looked at her. "How much time?" 24 hours. The number landed on the table. Pell shifted in his seat. Drevin kept his face steady because showing irritation in front of a Tier 4 representative would be undignified, and dignity was one of the few currencies that never lost value. 12 hours, he said. Voss considered this 18. This is not a negotiation. You're right. It's a scheduling discussion. The smile again, patient, unhurried. 18 hours. I'll have a formal response from my government. If they agree to the terms, I sign the document. If they have questions, I'll relay them. And if they refuse, she looks at him with those very still eyes. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Drevin agreed to 18 hours because the alternative was advancing the fleet now before a response which would look like aggression rather than enforcement. And the council cared about how things looked. 900 years of careful reputation management had taught them that. He stood. His staff stood with him. Voss stood too and extended her hand again, and he shook it again, and her grip was firm in a way that was not threatening, but was not soft either. Lieutenant Chin will walk you back to your shuttle, she said. Thank you for coming aboard, High Counselor. As Dreen turned to leave, he glanced once more at the hull plating mounted on the wall. The crew raider mining equipment. He wanted to ask more about that. He decided he would look it up in the records instead. Toville had questions. Drevin's security officer was waiting in the docking collar when the group returned to the shuttle, which meant he had left the meeting room early, which meant something had pulled him away. Drevin raised an eyebrow as Toville fell into step beside him. The ship, Toville said quietly. What about it? I took a walk while you were in the meeting. Lieutenant Chen escorted me, very pleasant, and showed me the ship. And Toville was quiet for the few seconds it took them to board the shuttle and seal the hatch behind the last staff member. Then he said, The corridors don't match. Drevin looked at him. Explain. I was counting steps, walking the corridors, estimating dimensions. Toville pulled out a small device and showed Drevin a hand-drawn diagram, a rough sketch of the ship's layout as best he'd been able to map it. From the outside, the ship is approximately 400 meters long. Standard layout for a vessel this size would give you maybe 40% usable interior volume after you account for engines, fuel, storage, hull thickness. He pointed to a section of his sketch. But the corridors I walked don't account for that. The usable space is larger by a significant margin. Drevin studied the sketch. You might have miscounted. I don't miscount. The shuttle undocked through the small porthole. Drevin caught one last look at the Asterisk Reckoning's asterisk hull as they pulled away. Long, angular, dark gray, almost black. What's your conclusion? Drevin asked. Either the hull is much thinner than it looks, which would make it extremely fragile, which doesn't track with the way the crew behaves, or there are sections of this ship that are hidden from a walking tour. Drevin thought about that for the entire shuttle ride back to the Asterisk Eternal Witness. He thought about it while he changed out of his diplomatic wear and back into his uniform. He thought about it while he ate. He thought about it at 200 hours when he was still awake, and the rest of the ship was running on skeleton crew, and the stars outside his window were not moving. Then he went to the bridge and found his sensor officer. Commander Yeth was a young Vioth officer who had graduated top of her class at the Council Military Institute and had a talent for reading sensor data that bordered on the supernatural. She was awake when Dreen arrived on the bridge, which said something about her habits. The human ship, Drevin said without preamble. What do our sensors say about it? Wythe pulled up the data on her console. Standard long-range scan, sir. We've been running passive monitoring since they docked. Show me the power signature. She pulled up a graph. The Reckoning's asterisk power output over time, a line that should be relatively flat, showing normal operation, normal power draw for life support, navigation, communications. Drevin looked at the line. It was not flat. It spiked regularly, not dramatically. The spikes were not huge, but they were consistent. Every 40 to 60 minutes, the ship's power draw increased sharply for roughly 90 seconds, then returned to baseline. What is that? Drevin asked. Unknown, said Youth. Our best guess is a charging cycle, some kind of capacitor system drawing power and storing it. Charging for what? Unknown weapon, possibly, but the frequency doesn't match any weapon system in our database. It's also too slow for a weapon-ready cycle. Most weapons charge in seconds or minutes. 40-minute intervals suggest something larger or something that requires very high total energy stored before it can operate. Draven stared at the graph. The spikes were small, patient, regular, like breathing. How long has it been running this cycle? Wyeth checked. Since approximately 2 hours after the ship entered our perimeter, sir, which meant it had started the cycle before the meeting had even begun. Can you tell how much energy has been stored? Not precisely. But if the cycle has been running for 18 hours at current draw, she did the math quickly on her secondary screen. A significant amount, sir. More than this class of ship should need for any standard operation. Draven looked out the viewport at the human ship, sitting quiet in the dark 3 kilometers off the asterisk, forever witnessing the asterisk port side. One ship 400 mm, dark gray hull almost black. He thought about the crew members who had not been afraid. Keep monitoring, he said. I want to know the moment anything about that power signature changes. Yes, sir. Yet paused. Sir, do you want me to begin a more aggressive scan? We could get better data with an active sensor sweep. Would they know we were scanning? Almost certainly. Draven thought about it. Aggressive scanning in diplomatic hold was technically a provocation. It said, "We do not trust you." Which they did not. But saying it out loud or saying it in sensor frequencies changed the nature of the meeting. Not yet, he said. He went back to his quarters. He did not sleep. He lay on his bunk in the dark and thought about 14 meetings and 14 acceptances and the Marin Collective who had held out for 6 hours and eventually signed because 6 hours was nothing against the weight of 300 ships. He thought about Voss, who had asked for 18. He thought about what she had said, "We're not the Marine Collective." And he thought about what she had not said, which was, "We're afraid." Because she hadn't said that, neither had anyone on her crew. Not one person on that ship in all the corridors and meeting. Rooms and docking airlocks had looked afraid. Draven had done 14 of these meetings. He knew what fear looked like. He knew what a species looked like when the mathematics of the situation settled on them. He knew the particular quality of silence that came over a room when a smaller civilization's representative finally understood that the choice was not between good outcomes. It was between bad outcomes and very bad outcomes. Voss had not had that silence. Voss had served coffee and talked about scheduling and smiled. At 800 hours, Lieutenant Chen sent a polite communication to the Asterisk Eternal Witness, informing them that Admiral Voss was ready to resume talks whenever the High Counselor wished. Draven went. This time he brought Tovil and Eth and told them both to pay attention to everything. Not the conversation, everything else. The walls, the sounds, the equipment, the crew, everything that was not the conversation. The meeting room on the Asterisk Reckoning looked the same. Voss was at the table when he arrived, a fresh cup of coffee in front of her. 2 other humans were with her this time. A man with close-cropped gray hair, who was introduced as Admiral Voss's senior tactical officer, Commander Hale, and a younger woman with dark eyes, and an expression of polite patience who was introduced simply as Dr. Park, ship's science lead. Draven sat, his staff sat, the hull plating was still on the wall. "You've had time to consult your government," he said. "What is the Assembly's position?" "The Assembly has a few questions," said Voss. Draven breathed in, breathed out. "As I said yesterday, this is not a negotiation. And as I said, these are questions." She folded her hands on the table. "The declaration requires us to withdraw from sectors 1421. That's 7 sectors. We've had active operations in those sectors for 6 years. Civilian settlements, research outposts, families." She said the word carefully, not dramatically. Just placed it there. Families. "The declaration gives us 30 days to complete the withdrawal." That is correct. "What happens to the settlements during those 30 days? Are they protected under Council oversight?" "They are considered human territory until the deadline passes, and after the deadline they are considered unauthorized occupation of Council-administered space." which means Dreven looked at her, which means the Council will take whatever steps are necessary to enforce the boundary. Voss nodded slowly, I see. She glanced down at the document and the research outposts. We have 11 active research stations in those sectors. One of them is a joint project with the Hall. Our Hall researchers were also required to withdraw. Dreven looked at his advisor Pell, who checked his records. Joint projects do not grant exemption, Pell said quietly, so our Hall colleagues would also be required to leave, within the deadline. Voss appeared to think about this. She turned to Dr. Park and said something in a low voice that Dreven's translator caught as a fragment. Something about the numbers and the surface area calculation. Park responded equally quietly. Then Voss looked back at Dreven. Hi, Counselor, she said. I want to ask you something, and I'd appreciate an honest answer. I'm always honest. Is there any version of this meeting where we don't sign the declaration? The room was quiet. Dreven looked at her. No, he said. There is not. That's what I thought. She picked up her coffee, took a long drink, and set it down. Then I'd like to ask you something else. She looked at him, and for the first time the smile changed. It did not disappear. It got smaller, quieter, and somehow more solid. The way a fire gets smaller but hotter when you compress it. How much do you know? She said about what this ship actually is. The room was very quiet. Tovil, standing against the wall behind Dreven, went still in the particular way that well-trained security officers go still when something shifts. It is a diplomatic vessel, Dreven said. It is also, said Voss. Yes. She glanced at Commander Hale, who was looking at the table with the neutral expression of someone who had heard this part of the conversation before. Then she looked back at Dreven. When the Assembly decided to respond to your fleet, we had a discussion about what to send. The options were complicated. You chose one ship. We chose this ship. The distinction was gentle but clear in the way she said it. Not a ship, this one. Dreven looked at her, at the hull plating on the wall, at Hale's neutral face, at Park's dark, patient eyes. Why? He said. Because one was enough, she said. And because more than that. She paused. She tilted her head very slightly, and the small, hot smile sat on her face, like something she had stopped trying to hide. We wanted to be polite about it. We wanted to give your council the opportunity to reconsider before this becomes a different kind of conversation. The Eternal Witness was 3 kilometers away. 300 ships were 11 light minutes from Earth. Dreven looked at the woman across the table who had asked for 18 hours and served coffee, and talked about scheduling and the old instinct in the back of his mind. The one that had kept something cautious alive for 900 years said, "Ask her what is on the ship." This time he asked, "Admiral Voss," he said, "what is on the ship?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said very simply, "Everything we needed." Outside the viewport, the stars were still. The Reckoning sat quiet in the dark, its power cycling in those small, patient, regular spikes, charging something in its belly that had no name in the Council's database. And in that moment, Dreven understood, not fully, not yet, but enough that the mathematics of 300 had never been the right mathematics. He just didn't know what the right mathematics were. Yet Dreven called his flag officers together at 1100 hours in the Eternal Witness war room. There were 9 of them, one from each member species currently represented in the fleet. They sat around a circular table under lights that were deliberately cooler and sharper than the rest of the ship. Because the Council had decided long ago that the room where you made hard decisions should feel like a hard room. No warmth, no comfort, just clarity. Dreven told them what Tovil had found, what Yeth had found, what Voss had said. The room was quiet for a moment when he finished. Then, Fleet Admiral Brask of the Hall, the largest and oldest officer in the room, shifted his broad frame and said, "She told you one ship was enough. She implied it. That is not an implication. That is a statement." Brask's posture said something more than his words. The particular angle of his shoulders that translated roughly as I have heard this tone before, and I did not like where it went. You said she was not afraid. Not visibly. In my experience, said Brask, there are two kinds of species who face a larger force without showing fear. The kind that has not yet understood what they are facing. And the other kind? Asked Admiral Save of the K, a narrow, fast-moving species who ran most of the Council's light combat wing. Brask looked at the table, the kind that has another silence. Drevin looked at his officers. He thought about what he knew. One ship, hidden interior volume, power cycling for 18 hours, a piece of CFT raider hull on the wall, a crew that had spent the whole visit looking like people waiting for something they had already decided was going to happen. Option 1, he said. We advance the fleet. We surround the Asterisk Reckoning and inform Admiral Voss that the time for discussion has passed. We give her 1 hour to transmit her government's acceptance. If she does not, we treat the ship as a hostile vessel and proceed accordingly. Proceed accordingly meaning asked save. Disable it minimally. We are not here to start a war. We are here to enforce a boundary declaration. Option 2, said Brask. We withdraw. We return to Council space. We table this matter and revisit it with more information. The room did not need to discuss option 2 for very long. Withdrawing without a signed declaration was not a neutral action. It was an admission. 900 years of consistent enforcement, 14 for 14 and the 15th. Time the Council retreated without a signature because one diplomatic ship had charged its power system and said something vague about having enough of whatever it needed. The Council's credibility was the only thing that kept the coalition together. Without it, option 2 did not lead to a safer outcome. It led to a slower, messier version of the same problem. Option 1, said Drevin, unanimous agreement. It was not quite unanimous. Brask voted yes, but his posture said something about the weight of that yes that Dreen chose not to translate directly. The fleet began to move at 1300 hours, not all 300 ships. That would have been excessive in a way that even the Council found uncomfortable. Drevin ordered the forward group, 60 ships, to advance from the outer perimeter toward the Asterisk Reckoning's asterisk position. 60 was still a number that communicated everything it needed to communicate. 60 warships tightening a circle around one 400-meter diplomatic vessel was not an ambiguous gesture. The Reckoning did not move. Drevin had expected some reaction, a retreat to a safer distance, a rapid communication from Voss, something that would indicate the situation had been recalibrated. The Reckoning sat exactly where it had been sitting since it arrived. Its running lights were on. Its communications array was active. It was by every sensor reading doing nothing. Hail them, said Drevin. Voss appeared on screen within seconds. She was not sitting at a table this time. She was on her own bridge standing with Hale and Park nearby and the rest of her crew at their stations. The bridge of the Asterisk Reckoning looked functional. That was the word for it. Not impressive, not elaborate. Clean lines, muted colors. People sitting at their stations with the focused attention of individuals who were not looking at the 60 ships tightening around them, but at their own screens, their own readouts, their own instruments. The High Counselor said, Voss, I was expecting your call. The fleet is advancing, said Drevin. I want to give you one final opportunity to transmit your government's acceptance before this situation changes in a way that will be difficult to reverse. I appreciate that, said Voss. I really do. She paused. I have a question for you first. Admiral, one question. Then I'll let you do what you're going to do. She looked at him with the still, flat patience she had worn since she first stepped through his communication screen. How much do you know about human history? Drevin did not answer immediately. Not political history, she said. Not the exploration history. I mean the older part. The part before we left our planet. She glanced sideways at something off-screen, then back. Because there is something about us that I think is relevant to this conversation, and I want to be fair to you about it before we proceed. Admiral the Fleet. We were at war for most of our history, she said. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way you state a fact that everyone in the room already knows, but has not said out loud yet. Continuous war. Thousands of years of it. Tribes, then kingdoms, then nations, then coalitions. We fought over land, over water, over belief systems, over lines on maps that weren't even real. We developed weapons against ourselves. We used them against ourselves. She paused again. And we survived that. All of it. And then we took everything we learned from thousands of years of hurting each other, and we applied it to engineering. The 60 ships were 3 light seconds out now. Driven watched the distance tick down on his secondary screen while Voss spoke. "I'm not telling you this to threaten you," she said. "I'm telling you because I think it's information you deserve to have before you give your next order." She looked directly into the camera with those still eyes and said, "Are you sure?" "Transmit your government's acceptance," said Drevin, "or stand by for enforcement action." Voss held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Okay," and closed the channel. Not a weapon. That was the first thing Driven noticed, and the most confusing one. When the asterisk reckoning finally moved, the ship did not power up weapons. It did not raise shields. It did not attempt to retreat. It turned slowly, almost lazily, rotating on its long axis until its bow was pointing not at the approaching fleet, but at a point in empty space, roughly 40 degrees off the fleet's port flank. "What is it targeting?" Dreen asked. "Nothing," said Yeth. "There's nothing in that direction." Clear space. Then what? The power signature spiked, not one of the small, regular 40-minute spikes. Something different. A single enormous draw. A full system surge that lit up YT's sensor console like a power grid failure. For roughly 4 seconds, the reckoning pulled so much energy through its systems that the heat bloom alone was visible on their thermal sensors from 3 kilometers away. Then it stopped. Nothing happened. No explosion, no beam, no projectile. The forward group of 60 ships continued their advance without incident. Their weapons were armed and targeted, and the reckoning was sitting right there, and nothing was happening. "Report," said Drevin. "No incoming fire," said Yith. "No active weapon signatures from the human vessel." "The power spike has ended." She stared at her screen. "Sir, I'm getting an anomalous reading in the space the human ship was pointing at." "Define anomalous." "The space is folded. Something has altered local space-time geometry in a region approximately 200 kilometers across at that bearing." She looked up from her console, and her expression was the expression of someone reporting a fact they had not yet processed emotionally. "Sir, something has been placed there. I don't have it on any scan. No mass reading, no M signature, no thermal output. But the geometry of space says something is there." Drevin stared at the display. Empty space with something in it that wasn't showing up on any instrument, except the fact that space itself was bent around it. "Open a channel to the other fleet commands," he said. "I want Sir Tovol on his shoulder. The asterisk reckoning is transmitting not to the asterisk eternal witness asterisk, not on standard communication channels, a tight beam signal highly encrypted aimed at Earth, aimed at home." Driven watched the signal data on With's board and thought, "She is not asking for instructions. She already has them. She is telling them it is time." The 60 forward ship reached a distance of 1 light second. "Halt the advance," said Drevin. The order went through. The 60 ships decelerated and held position in a wide arc around the asterisk reckoning. The human ship sat inside that arc like something comfortable in a cage it had built itself. "Hail them again," said Drevin. No response. He tried twice more. Nothing. Sir said yes. The power is cycling again, not the big spike. The smaller ones were back. The 40-minute charge. Patient, regular, already climbing back toward whatever level it had been at before the discharge. Whatever it had just put in that empty patch of space had cost it 1 charge. Now it was building the next one. Drevin looked at the display at the asterisk reckoning at the patch of bent space. It was pointed at his 60 ships, frozen in a holding pattern. They had not expected to be holding. "Commander, yes," he said. "Can you tell what the anomalous region contains?" "No, sir. There is no conventional signature. It is as if the object or objects in that region have been engineered not to return sensor data. Can you tell how large the region is? 200 kilometers across, as I said. But sir, she looked at her readings again. I think the region is expanding slowly, barely measurable. But yes, the bent space, the invisible something was growing outward at a rate that would take days to matter at its current speed. Days. Drevin thought about the Reckoning and its crew who had not been afraid. He thought about Vas explaining thousands of years of war, stating quietly like a woman laying down a fact she hoped you would pick up. He thought about the power spike and the tight beam transmission to Earth and the steadily cycling charge rebuilding in the belly of a ship that was still sitting calmly inside a ring of 60 warships without attempting to run. He looked at his security officer, Touville. Sir, how many charges do you think it can store? Touville looked at the sensor data, at the time elapsed at the recharge rate. He did the numbers in a way that Drevin could see, even without watching the small shift in posture that meant the numbers were not good. At current recharge rate, Touville said it will reach full charge again in approximately 42 minutes. And then it places another Drevin gesture at the display. Another one of those, presumably. And if we destroy the ship right now before it can fire again? Touville was quiet for a moment. Then, the first one is already out there, sir, expanding. We don't know what it is and we can't scan it, and we don't know how to stop it because we don't know what it does. He paused. Destroying the asterisk Reckoning now only stops the second one. The first is already in play. Drevin looked at the expanding invisible region in space. He thought about 60 ships, 240 ships still on the outer perimeter, Earth and its tiny fleet of 400 patrol vessels. He thought about the mathematics he had been so certain of when he arrived. 300 to 1. He had been thinking about the wrong number all along. The right number was not 300, not 1. Not even the 18 hours Vas had asked for. The right number was 42 minutes. That was how long the Council had to decide what to do before the asterisk Reckoning deployed its second invisible, unscannable expanding object into the space between his fleet and home. And the Reckoning was still just sitting there running lights on crew at their stations, charging patiently in the dark. Drevin sat down in his command chair and looked at the empty stars and thought, what did she put out there? And underneath that, quieter, colder. The question he had been avoiding since the first moment he had seen the crew members, who did not look afraid. What else does she have? 41 minutes, 38 minutes. Drevin called the war room back together and told them what Eth had found. The anomalous region, the invisible something expanding slowly through the space between the fleet and home. The recharge cycle is already climbing back toward full. The room absorbed it the way experienced officers absorbed bad information. Quietly, quickly, already moving to the next question before the last one had fully landed. Destroy the ship, said Admiral Save immediately. Right now, 60 ships are at point-blank range. We reduce it to debris before it can fire again. And the first deployment, said Brask. We deal with the first deployment after we neutralize the source. We don't know what the first deployment is. Then we figure that out while it's no longer getting company. Drevin held up a hand. Before we do anything irreversible, he said, I want to understand what we are dealing with. Yith, can you give me anything more on the anomalous region? Wythe had been working at her console since the briefing began. She looked tired in the way of someone who had been staring at readings that refused to make sense and had stopped expecting them to. I have more data, sir, not more clarity. She pulled up the display. The region is expanding slowly, but it is not expanding uniformly. It is spreading along the gaps between our ships, following the spaces in our formation. No one spoke for a moment. It is not just expanding outward, yet said it is threading itself through us. Drevin looked at the display. The Ben space region had started as a roughly circular area 200 km across, aimed at a patch of empty space. Now the display showed it differently. Tendrils barely measurable extending along the negative space between ships, following the gaps in the fleet formation like water finding the paths of least resistance through rock. What does that tell you about what it contains? Drevin asked. Whatever is in there, said Yith, is not passive. It is navigating. Another silence. The particular kind of silence that falls when everyone in a room has the same thought at the same time. And no one wants to say it first. Brask said it. She fired at empty space because she was aiming at us. Not at our ships, at the space between them. 29 minutes. Draven made a decision. He hailed the reckoning again. This time, Vas answered immediately, which told him she had been watching and waiting for the call. Tell me what you deployed, he said. I was wondering when you'd ask directly, she said. Her voice was calm and the smile was gone, not replaced by hostility, just gone. What was there instead was plainer, more honest, and somehow harder to read. I'll tell you, not because I'm required to, but because I think you deserve to understand the situation you're in before anyone makes it worse. Then tell me what I deployed, she said. Are about 14,000 of them. They're small enough that your sensors can't resolve individual units. They're coated in a material that absorbs rather than reflects your scan frequencies, which is why the space reads as bent rather than as objects. They've been threading through your formation for the last 20 minutes. She paused. They are currently distributed through approximately 60% of your fleet. 28 minutes. Draven kept watching the clock on his secondary screen as she spoke. What do they do? He said on their own right now. Nothing. They are completely inert. No weapons, no explosives, no active systems. She said it like someone reading from a document. Clean, precise, no decoration. Each seed is a positioning unit. It finds a stable location relative to a nearby ship, locks in and waits. Wait for what? A signal from me. Draven looked at the display at the tendrils of bent space threading between his ships, at the 60 vessels in their holding arc around the asterisk reckoning, and the 240 still on the outer perimeter. The signal tells them to do what? He said that it depends on the signal. She tilted her head. There are different ones. The assessment signal tells them to compile targeting data on the vessel they're nearest to and transmit it back to this ship. The disruption signal tells them to generate a localized electromagnetic pulse, which would take down unshielded electronics on nearby ships for approximately 4 to 9 minutes. At the terminal signal, she stopped. I don't want to use the terminal signal. I want to be clear about that. I am not in this room looking for a way to kill 300 ships worth of people. But you could. She looked at him steadily. The terminal signal would tell each seed to breach the hull of the nearest vessel at its current location. 14,000 breach points distributed across your fleet simultaneously. She paused. I want to say again that I am not looking for that outcome. 25 minutes. Draven's hands were flat on the table in front of him. He was aware of this because he had placed them there deliberately because he was not going to clench them, and he was not going to stand, and he was not going to give the asterisk reckoning or its admiral the satisfaction of watching his posture change. You built this ship, he said specifically for this scenario. Yes, said Voss. You anticipated that the Council would send a fleet. We anticipated that eventually someone would send a fleet. The Council was the most likely candidate. She seemed to consider how to say the next part. We have been watching the Council's boundary enforcement record for 9 years. 14 declarations, 14 acceptances. The pattern is very clear. You find a Tier 4 species that is expanding. You send an overwhelming force. You make the mathematics obvious. The species sees the numbers and accepts the terms. She paused. It is a good strategy. It works because the species you deal with always evaluates mathematics the same way. They count ships. They compare ships. They see that they cannot win a ship-to-ship engagement, and they stand down. That is rational behavior. She said we are not always rational. Something in the room shifted. Not a physical thing, a temperature thing, a pressure thing. The feeling of a word landing that had been waiting a long time to be said. What you did not account for, said Vas, is that we have spent most of our history fighting each other. We are a species that has been at war in one form or another for as long as we have kept records. We have fought enemies who were larger than us, better equipped, better organized. We have been outnumbered in wars that we won anyway. She leaned forward very slightly, We are very good at asymmetric conflict. We are very good at finding the one thing a larger force has not considered, and making that thing matter more than everything else they brought. And what did we not consider? Draven asked, though he was beginning to know the answer. The space between your ships, she said. You thought about your numbers. You thought about your firepower. You thought about your formation and your approach vectors and your hull ratings. You did not think about the empty space inside your formation, because in a fleet action, that space is tactically meaningless. Ships fight ships. The space between them is just distance. She paused. We thought about it for 4 years. 21 minutes. Draven looked at the display one more time, at the Ben space tendrils threading through his fleet's formation like roots, at the asterisk reckoning sitting quiet and patient inside its ring of 60 warships, at the recharge cycle ticking upward on Yith's console. If we destroy this ship right now, he said, the seeds are already deployed. You said they wait for a signal from you. If you are dead, the signal never comes. That's correct, she said. So destroying you actually ends the threat. Also correct. She met his eyes. If you can do it fast enough. He caught the qualifier, meaning the seeds also have a passive trigger. If this ship stops broadcasting its identification frequency, if it goes silent for any reason, they read that as a terminal event, and they act without a signal. She held his gaze. They were designed that way specifically so that destroying this ship is not a clean solution. If you kill us, the seeds still fire. You lose the fleet anyway, and you have also started a war. The clock said 19 minutes. Draven sat back in his chair. He thought about Vas, asking him how much he knew about human history. He thought about her saying, we are not always rational. He thought about 14 declarations and 14 acceptances, and what it said about the Council that their strategy had worked so consistently that they had stopped asking whether it would stop working. They had walked into a system they thought they understood. One homeworld, 400 patrol ships, 2 mining stations, soft-bodied, temperature-sensitive creatures in pressurized suits. They had not asked the right question. They had asked, can they fight us? They should have asked, have they been preparing for us? How long? Draven said. Voss looked at him. How long have you been building this for the Council specifically? Since we found the Vin corridor, she said. Since we realized we were not alone and started mapping who our neighbors were, she sat back. We found the records of your boundary declarations, all 14 of them. We studied them. We studied your fleet doctrine, your approach patterns, your sensor capabilities, your formation preferences. We built the seeds to fit the gaps in your specific formation protocols. She paused. The reckoning was not built to fight a fleet. It was built to fight your fleet. Somewhere in the back of Draven's mind, the old instinct that had been running quiet since the moment he stepped onto this ship, the one that had said, ask her what is on this ship, was now saying something different. It was saying she is still not telling you everything. The seeds, Draven said slowly. You have 14,000 on board. You deployed them with one discharge, one 42-minute charge cycle. He looked at her. What did the second charge cycle produce? Voss was quiet for a moment, a beat too long to be thinking of the answer. She already had the answer. She was deciding whether to give it. The second cycle, she said, is different. The seeds are a defensive system. They exist to neutralize your fleet's ability to take offensive action against us. The second system is not defensive. 18 minutes. What is it? Draven asked. It is what happens if you choose not to stand down, she said. It is what we built for the scenario where the Council decided that losing 300 ships was an acceptable cost for maintaining the precedent of your boundary declarations. She leaned forward again because we wanted that scenario too. We asked ourselves, what if they don't care about the fleet? What if the Council's credibility matters more to them than 300 ships and the people on them? Draven said nothing. We could not let that be a viable option for you, she said, because if you could absorb the fleet loss and still enforce the declaration, then our defensive system would not be enough. So we built a second answer. Her voice stayed even factual. The second discharge deploys a different kind of package. Not seeds, anchors, 20 of them. Each one creates a permanent fold in local spacetime like what you detected earlier, but stable, lasting. She paused. The anchors would be placed along the Council's most used transit corridors, your FTL lanes, not blocking them, positioned adjacent to them. But an anchor near a transit point generates enough space-time distortion that anything using that transit point at speed would experience. She chose her words carefully. Difficulties. The war room was absolutely silent. How long would the anchors remain? Drevin asked. They do not degrade, said Voss. They are permanent. Permanent. 20 stable space-time folds positioned along the Council's transit lanes. Not blocking them, just there. An invisible obstacle in a road you had been using for 900 years, the kind of thing that would take decades to map, longer to understand, and cost ships every year until you did. Draven thought about the gift basket 11 years ago. He had found it baffling then, cheerful creatures bumbling through the Veen corridor with fruit and packaged items, and an extremely enthusiastic apology. The same creatures who had spent 11 years doing this, who had looked at the Council's 900-year record and found the specific gap in the armor, the specific empty space between the ships, and then built quietly and cheerfully, and without any apparent anger, a weapon that fit exactly into that gap. 15 minutes. What do you want? Draven said. To keep our sectors, Voss said. Voss. To keep the settlements and the research stations and the families that are already there to continue expanding at the rate we have been. She paused. And for the Council to understand that we are not the Marin Collective. We are not any of your 14 previous meetings, and the sooner everyone understands that the better the outcome is for every species represented in your fleet. The clock said 14 minutes. Draven looked at the display at the asterisk reckoning at the Ben space threads woven through the gaps in 300 ships at the second charge approaching full. He thought about 900 years. He thought about 14 declarations. He thought about the fact that Voss had come here with coffee and scheduling discussions and small patient smiles, and had in the space of 36 hours changed the mathematics of the conversation so completely that he was no longer certain what the mathematics were. He thought about one thing Voss had said and kept coming back to it, turning it over because it was the most important thing she had said and he had almost missed it. We built the seeds to fit the gaps in your specific formation protocols. She had not built a weapon. She had built an answer to a question. A specific studied, rehearsed answer to the specific question the Council would ask, which meant she had also built an answer to the next question the Council would ask after that, and the one after that. She had not sent one ship because one ship was enough to fight 300. She had sent one ship because she had already fought 300 on paper in simulations in the 4 years of preparation that had produced this vessel and this crew and those 14,000 seeds and this exact conversation. The battle had been over before the fleet left Council space. Draven understood that now with the clean, cold certainty of someone who had just found the last piece of a puzzle and did not like the picture it made. The humans had been smiling, he realized, not because they were confident. They had been smiling because they were finished. 13 minutes. He looked at Admiral Voss on the screen. She was waiting, not impatiently, not nervously, just waiting the way someone waits when they have already done everything they came to do. I need to consult my officers, Draven said. Of course, said Voss. He cut the channel. He looked around the war room at the 9 flag officers of the Galactic Sovereignty Council, and none of them were speaking, and all of them were looking at him. Brask's posture said, I told you. Thoughts, said Draven. The room was quiet for 3 seconds. Then Save said in a voice that was stripped of everything except the bare mechanical function of words. Can we identify the seeds, target them individually? No, said Youth from her station. They are below our sensor resolution. Can we purge the formation, create a field that neutralizes them in mass? We don't know enough about their construction to know what would affect them. Can we jam the signal she uses to trigger them? We don't know the frequency. Save fell silent. 12 minutes. Draven looked at the display one last time at the clock at the asterisk reckoning. He thought about one more thing she had said. We are not always rational. A rational species facing this situation would have built a larger fleet, would have matched the Council's numbers, or tried to have looked at 300 ships and decided they needed 301. An irrational species, or a species that thought differently about the problem, had looked at 300 ships and built something that lived in the spaces between them. He made his decision. He picked up the channel and hailed Admiral Voss. And when she appeared on screen, he said 6 words that had never been said in the 9th century of the Galactic Sovereignty Council's existence. What are your proposed terms, Admiral? And Voss looked at him, and the small, patient, compressed fire smile came back one last time, and she said, I thought you'd never ask. Voss had the terms ready. That was the first thing Draven noticed. She did not pause to collect her thoughts. She did not ask for a moment. She opened a second screen beside her, glanced at it once, and began speaking with the focused clarity of someone reading from a document they had written long before this conversation started. First, she said, humanity retains full sovereignty over sectors 1421. No withdrawal, no deadline. The settlements and research stations remain. The joint project with the Hall continues under its existing agreements. Draven noted it said nothing. Second, the Council formally recognizes the Unified Earth Assembly as a Tier 1 civilization, not Tier 4, not a provisional classification. Full recognition with all the standing and protections that it carries. Across the war room, Draven heard Pell make a very small sound. Tier 1 recognition for a species with 400 patrol ships and 2 mining stations was not something the Council's classification system had a procedure for. It had never needed one. Third, the Council's fleet withdraws from this system within 6 hours of treaty signature and does not return without explicit invitation from the Assembly. And fourth, Draven asked, because there was always a fourth. Fourth, said Voss. The seed stays. The war room was very quiet. They stay deployed, she said. In your fleet, in the formation gaps exactly where they are right now, inert as they are now. They will not activate unless the treaty is broken. She let that settle. They are not a weapon at that point. They are a record, a guarantee. The treaty is not enforced by goodwill. It is enforced by the fact that the seeds are already there and both sides know it. Draven looked at her. You are asking us to sign a treaty that has a loaded weapon sitting inside our own ships. I am asking you to sign a treaty that you cannot break without consequence. She said, which is the only kind of treaty that works. She paused. The Council has held its authority for 900 years through the credibility of its enforcement. You understand better than anyone that a guarantee without teeth is just a wish. These are the teeth. They belong to both sides. He thought about that. It was not wrong. It was in fact the most honest thing anyone had said in 2 days of talking. A peace with no mechanism for enforcement was not a peace. It was a delay. If the treaty holds, Draven said, permanently the seeds are never activated and we carry them indefinitely. Yes, and we cannot remove them. You can try, she said. You won't find them, but you can try. The plain, honest tone again, no edge to it. The alternative is that you decline the terms and I send the second discharge, in which case the seeds activate, the anchors go into your transit lanes, and we have a war that neither side can win cleanly. We've modeled it. She glanced at her screen. The Council wins eventually, probably. But it costs you 40 to 60 years of disrupted transit infrastructure and somewhere between 8 and 12% of your active fleet in the first engagement alone. She looked back at him. And then you still have to deal with us after that. Except by then we have had 40 to 60 years to build more Reckoning Asterisk-class vessels. The clock said 11 minutes. Draven looked at his flag officers at Brask, whose posture had moved from I told you to something more tired and more complicated. At Save, who was staring at the table with the expression of a person reassembling a picture they thought they had understood. At Pell, who was running the Tier 1 reclassification against every piece of Council law he had memorized and finding apparently that the law had not anticipated needing to say no. Give me 10 minutes, Draven said. You have 11, said Voss. He cut the channel. The 10 minutes were not enough, and were also more than enough, because the decision had been clear for some time, and the 10 minutes were really just the space needed for everyone in the room to arrive at it from their own direction. Save got there by way of the numbers. Brask got there by way of the 40 to 60 years. Pell got there by way of the law, which in the absence of explicit prohibition had always granted the High Counselor emergency authority to negotiate non-standard terms in the field. Drevin got there by way of something simpler. He thought about a species that had spent thousands of years fighting itself, that had developed weapons against itself and used them against itself and survived all of it. That had looked at the stars when it finally got there and found a galaxy full of larger, older, better-armed civilizations, and had thought quietly, patiently, without anger, for 11 years. We need to be ready, not for conquest. Voss's terms were not the terms of a species that wanted to take something. They were the terms of a species that wanted to be left alone and had built exactly enough to guarantee it. The Council's strength had always been the willingness to act. Humanity, it turned out, was the willingness to prepare. He thought about 14 boundary declarations and 14 acceptances and what they had in common. Every species the Council had ever faced this way had looked at the fleet and calculated the cost of resistance and decided the cost was too high. That was rational. That was correct. Humanity had looked at the fleet and decided to make resistance free. That was something else entirely. We accept the terms, Drevin said with one modification. He opened the channel. Voss was waiting. The clock said 9 minutes. She had the same expression she had worn through most of the last 2 days. That patient, settled stillness like something that had finished moving. One modification, Drevin said. The seeds, both sides agree that they are a monitoring system only, that their presence in Council vessels carries no offensive meaning while the treaty stands, that they are never used for intelligence gathering, no activation of the assessment signal, no targeting data collected. He looked at her. They are only ever activated if the treaty is violated. Both sides confirm this in the treaty language. Voss considered this for 3 seconds. Agreed. In one addition from our side, he said, the Council requests formal diplomatic exchange, a human ambassador to the Council chambers, a Council representative to Earth. Something shifted in Voss's face. The smallest thing. He had spent 2 days watching her face, and he caught it. A brief fractional softening around the eyes there and gone. Agreed, she said. We'd like that. The treaty document was drafted in 30 minutes. Legal staff from both sides worked across the open channel, trading language, confirming translations, checking against Council law and Assembly lost simultaneously. It was the fastest treaty drafting in Council history, which was partly because the terms were simple, and partly because 9 minutes had concentrated everyone's focus considerably. At 1847 hours, Council Standard Time, Drevin signed it on behalf of the Galactic Sovereignty Council. Voss signed it on behalf of the Unified Earth Assembly. At 1849 hours, the power cycling on the asterisk reckoning stopped. The second discharge was stood down. The seeds remained inert, invisible, embedded in the fleet's formation gaps like silent punctuation at the end of a sentence no one wanted to finish. At 1900 hours, Drevin ordered the fleet to begin withdrawal. He went back to the reckoning asterisk one more time before the fleet left. He had not planned to. The treaty was signed. The withdrawal was underway. There was no procedural reason to return to the human ship. But he went anyway because there was one question he had not asked, and he thought he might not get another chance. Voss met him at the docking collar herself, just her, no staff. She looked the same as she had for 2 days. Uniform, short hair, flat face. She also looked slightly tired in a way that had not been visible before, which was the first sign of something that was not the surface she had been showing him. He had wondered about that. What was under the patience, whether the stillness was genuine or constructed? He was beginning to think it was both. One question, he said. She gestured for him to walk with her. They moved down the corridor, past the crew stations, past the functional walls in the warm yellow light. Basket, she said. "Your crew," he said. "When we came aboard, when the fleet was tightening around you, when the advance began," he looked at her. "They were not afraid. I have seen species face a council fleet. I know what being afraid looks like. Your crew did not look like that." He paused. "Why?" Voss walked beside him without answering immediately. They passed a young crew member, one of the ones Dreven had noticed on the first visit, sitting at a navigation station. The young man glanced up, saw the High Counselor, and gave the same easy nod as before. Relaxed, present, not afraid. "How much do you know about how we smile?" Voss asked. Dreven looked at her. "It is an expression of positive emotion. It is also what we do when we are terrified," she said. "It is what we do in situations of high stress to signal to each other that we are still functioning, that we have not collapsed. It is partly performance and partly genuine, and the line between those two things is thinner than you might think." She glanced at him sideways. "My crew was scared. Most of them, not all of it, but most of it." Dreven thought about the crew members who had nodded. The young officer at the navigation station, the easy posture, the absence of visible fear. "Then why did they look like that?" he asked. "Because they had trained for this," she said. "Specifically this. For 2 years before this deployment, they ran simulations of this exact scenario. Council fleet at the outer perimeter. 60 ships in a holding arc. The seeds deployed, the charges building, the clock running." She paused. They had failed those simulations many times, made mistakes, lost the ship on paper a dozen times, and then they got it right over and over, until getting it right was what felt normal. She stopped walking. They were at a junction in the corridor, and she turned to face him. "When you train for something until you know every outcome, every variable, every decision point, you are still afraid when it happens. You are a biological creature and your body does what bodies do. But the fear is familiar. You recognize it, and somewhere underneath the fear is a steadier thing because you have been here before." She paused again. "Not here exactly, but here in every way that matters." Dreven looked at her. "Preparation," he said. "Preparation," she said. He thought about it, about what it meant, that a species had built this ship and trained this crew, and drafted these terms, and done all of it before the council had even scheduled the meeting, before the fleet had even assembled. "How many people on Earth know the ship exists?" he asked. "Most of them," she said. "We don't keep secrets." "Well, someone always tells." There was a small warmth in her voice that had not been there before. "People know we built it. They know what it does. When the fleet showed up on our long-range sensors, the news was everywhere, billions of people watching." She looked at the hull plating on the wall as they passed it. They weren't afraid either. Not mostly. They were watching to see if it worked. And if it had not worked, she was quiet for a moment. "Then we would have built the next one differently." She said it was not bravado. It was not even confidence in the conventional sense. It was something flatter and more persistent than confidence, something that did not require an audience or a guarantee, a species that had been knocked down enough times that the knocking down had stopped being the relevant variable. The relevant variable was whether you got up and what you built next. Dreven walked back to the shuttle. He stood in the docking collar for a moment before crossing over, and he turned around one last time. Voss was standing at the end of the corridor watching him go. "High Counselor," she said. "For what it's worth, we didn't want this to go badly. We prepared for it to go badly, because that is what you do. But we didn't want it." He looked at her. "What did you want?" "Neighbors," she said simply. "We have a whole galaxy and we have been alone in our corner of it for a long time." The tiredness was more visible now, and under it, something else. Something genuine and uncomplicated that did not fit in the same room as seeds and transit anchors and 42-minute charge cycles. "We just wanted it done right." He nodded once. He crossed the docking collar and sealed the hatch behind him. The fleet withdrew in good order. 6 hours, as the treaty specified. 300 ships pulling back from the edge of human space in the long, deliberate movement of a tide going out. The asterisk Eternal Witness was the last to go by custom. The flagship always departed last. Drevin stood on the bridge and watched the asterisk reckoning on the display screen as the distance grew. One ship, 400 men, or dark gray hull in the dark of space, already small against the background, getting smaller. "Sir," said Yes from her station. "The seeds I know," he said. They were still there. He could feel them in a way that had nothing to do with sensors, that awareness of a thing you cannot see or measure but cannot unknown. 14,000 small, quiet things distributed through the fleet's formation gaps, inert, patient, going home with them like a reminder, written in a language with only one word. Remember, not a threat. She had been clear about that. Not a weapon in the ordinary sense, something more precise than a weapon, a record, an insurance policy, a small permanent presence in the space between his ships that said, "We were here and we are not going anywhere, and neither is this." He thought about what the council chambers would say when he returned, about the special session that would need to be called, about 29 votes that had been cast on the assumption that this would be the 15th, and it had been the first of something else entirely. He thought about a new seat in the council chambers, about a human ambassador walking through those carved bone-hole walls for the first time into a room designed to make visitors feel small. And he found himself wondering whether that ambassador would feel small. He suspected none. He looked at the display one last time. The reckoning was barely visible now, a small dark shape against the starfield, shrinking as the distance opened between them. He thought about thousands of years of war, about a species that had inflicted every possible damage upon itself, and came through it with an unbroken habit of getting back up. About a diplomatic vessel named Asterisk. The moment when debts were settled that had arrived at a meeting between 300 warships in one and had not brought weapons. It had brought preparation, which turned out to be the same thing in a more permanent form. "Course set for council space," said the navigation officer. "Proceed," said Drevin. The Eternal Witness turned and accelerated. The reckoning disappeared from the display. Human space fell away behind them. The stars ahead were the same stars they had always been, older than anyone in this fleet, indifferent to the question of who was large and who was small, and who had sent 300 ships and who had sent one. But the space between those stars was different now. 14,000 things in it that had not been there before. And somewhere in a blue and white planet 11 light minutes back, billions of people who had been watching their screens were finding out that the mathematics had worked, that the preparation had worked, that one ship had been enough. And they were smiling, not because they had won, because they had been ready. There was a difference. It had taken 900 years and 14 declarations, and one very patient admiral with a cup of coffee and a piece of Kree Raider hull on her wall to make the distinction clear. But now it was clear. And somewhere in the formation gaps of the Council's finest fleet, 14,000 small, quiet things went home with them, and waited and remembered.